but they do more of an activity-based assessment in order to facilitate activities that they're going to be able to observe the child in these areas. And then you guys know as well as I do the other things that they're looking for. They're looking for self-stimming. They're looking for, does the student have an area of interest that they tend to always talk about? They're going to be looking for those things, but these are the parts that go along with, I apologize for that. These are the parts that go along with what you saw in that legal framework as we come over here. And it talks about other characteristics often associated with autism. And, these are the things that as they're working on those activities in order to pull these pieces, they're going to also look for engagement in repetitive activities, stereotyped movements, resistance to environmental change or change in daily routines, or unusual responses to sensory experiences. You guys know, and I'm sure you've seen, they can be in the middle of an evaluation, and then you have a child that's going to take that pencil and going to put it up to their nose, then they may lick the end of the eraser. Okay, so they're looking for those kinds of things that are unusual responses to sensory experiences. They may have that child that, all these things are going on in the background and they don't even look towards those things. And so those are all the things that they look for and look at as far as just meeting that eligibility criteria. When I go back to the slides, I want to take a second to talk about the special education piece because, we've got the special education piece and it's a two-pronged eligibility criteria for special education. The first prong is whether the child is a child with a disability. So you have to go through all of this criteria for eligibility in the evaluation, and then you're going to decide, hey, is this a child with a disability? But the second prong is there an educational need? Okay. And so that's where you start having to split hairs a little bit between, okay, we may have a child that appears to have an impairment or a disability, but they also have to have that educational need. Now, we always have to tell people the educational need should not be based on did they pass STAR, did they not pass STAR, right? So we're working towards making sure that we're looking past just the grades. It's not just that they're making straight A's or they're making A's and B's or that they're passing or that they pass STAR, but we're also having to look more at the social emotional pieces as well. And so both of those prongs are the eligibility for special education. Here's where I just have this written out for you of if I had gone into from the legal framework, if I had actually gone into those regulations, or I think on the framework it was calling them citations, I would have seen the CFR here as well as the Texas Administrative Code. Okay, so you see the IDEA regulations, and then you see what Texas says about it. Okay, and the other thing that you'll notice is you see the team's written report of evaluation must include specific recommendations for ... And so I think it's one of the things, and one of the things that I know Laura and I have talked about when we talked about me doing this presentation is we talked about the idea that when you're in Texas, or even when you're going through the federal definitions, you'll see that it comes from a team. So it's not about one person saying, I see this or I see that. I know you guys don't have any parents that come into your office and they have been on the internet and they have looked, and we all know that those parents are not necessarily they're looking for answers is probably the best way for me to talk about that. And you guys know that as well. Obviously, there's some type of issue. What they're trying to do is they're trying to find answers. They're trying to find ways to make it better. They're trying to find help, if you will. And so sometimes it's, oh yeah, they do this. Oh yeah, they do that. But yet, if you watch over a period of time, we may or may not see all of those pieces. And so it's important to us that it's a team approach, because not only do we take what the parent sees under consideration, what the physician sees under consideration, but then we also go in and we try to look at in an environment, and also not in just a home environment, but with all of these activities based on the eligibility, do we see the pieces that meet that criteria? And so as we move out of the eligibility area and start talking more about the autism supplement services and support. So, when Laura and I first started talking about doing this training and really talking about how we all can work together, I think one of the first things that we both realized when we were visiting with each other is how much of a and lack of knowledge is probably not necessarily the right word, but hey, well, we didn't even realize that that was available. And you and I both know that depending on what school district you're in, depending on what area you're in, there tends to be more supports, more resources than in other areas. However, what I want to show you guys is the autism supplement, because once we have a student that has been determined to be a student with an eligibility in the area of autism. The next step is to then, based on peer-reviewed, research-based educational programs and practices, the ARD committee determines whether the following strategies are needed. And so, what you will see is in the commissioner's rules, you will see that they go through and there are 16 pages of areas that the district needs to be looking at, those research-based practices that need to be considered for each student. And so right here you start looking at it, and the first thing it talks about is, what do we need to look at when we start talking about extended year programming, when we talk about autism? And so there's, what kinds of things do we need to look at when we talk about daily schedules reflecting minimal and structured time? And so you'll see that the commissioner's rules outlines, and I'm not going to go through each one of these pages, but you'll see that they hit on all these areas. I pulled this one up because this is what the supplement looks like, or somewhat what it would look like in one of the IEP meetings. So you'll see that when we break it down, you should be, so every student that's determined to have an impairment in the area of autism, when they go to their IEP meeting, this supplement should be utilized in their meeting, where the parent and the committee looks at each one of these areas to determine if this student has a need in this area. And so you'll see that it's extended educational programming. Okay, so this is where we're looking at, we've got to make sure we've got behavior in there. We've got to make sure we've got social skills, communication, self-help. Is there additional time to the school day and or school year that we think this child needs added in their IEP in order to help with these areas? The next one is daily schedules reflecting minimal unstructured time. Okay. And so, this one is very important, because the goal of this supplement, in my opinion, and really why we even have it, is so that as my child moves from one educator to the next, that this supplement outlines everything that we're doing, so that as this child moves from one person to the next, everyone can see here what is expected, what should continue being done. I think this daily schedule reflecting minimal unstructured time is an area where I always talk to my staff that I serve in Region 8, and I talk about how if a student has a visual schedule, we need to make sure that there's a picture of that visual schedule. We need to make sure that we have that to where, if this student's teacher changes, moves, is gone, and if someone else has to step in, then all of us are able to see, hey, this is what this looks like. This is what is working for this child. So, how do we look at flexibility within routines for this child? A lot of people talk about the first and the next. If this student is one that has a structured time, even during transition periods, then, they go through the checklist of, do I need to go to the restroom? Do I need to do this? What is it that I'm going to pick to do during this time in order that I'm not just sitting there unstructured? In-home and community-based training. I think this is a very important area, and especially with our parents of children, with younger children. We need to make sure that we're looking at, does that parent need some type of in-home training? Does that parent need some community-based training to understand and to help with the generalization or the transition from home to school, school to home, home to community, school to community? So often we hear of parents that say, "Oh no, we don't go out to eat. Oh no, we don't go to a football game." All those pieces of how do we help that family with transitions so that everyone has those activities, those pieces in mind of what they need to do to facilitate movement. Positive behavior support strategies. And this is a big one. We all know, and you guys have probably seen it just like we've seen it, behavior is a concern like never before. And we all keep saying we're post-COVID. I keep wondering how many years we're going to say we're post-COVID. And we all know that COVID is still here, it's still happening. But we all know that we're going to be facing challenges for quite a few years because of children that have not been in structured activities like they may have been during that time that we were out of school. But positive behavior supports, we've got to look at, when we're looking at kids and we're going through the supplement in the IEP meeting, we need to make sure that we're talking about what works. What does this child, what is this child interested in? What makes this child tick that will allow us to educate this child? And so that's where we get into this piece right here, is knowing how it becomes a, what do we know sets off the child with an antecedent? What are replacement behaviors for behaviors that the child does that we want to try to extinguish? And then how do we reinforce those replacement behaviors or those behaviors that are positive in order to make sure that the student is getting the right message in what we want to send? And then this last part is database decisions. I think this is one of the hardest things for educators because they see it as something that is going to take up a lot of time. Whereas we see it as we're trying to train them as, it doesn't have to be some broad, elaborate thing. It can just be as easy as a check mark and a little time stamp of what time did it happen, so that they're able to go back to help us with determination of how we make sure we're putting things in place in order to de-escalate situations before they become an out of control situation. Futures planning. Anytime we're talking about children with autism, we need to be looking at from the beginning, at any age, of how do we integrate the living, working community and educational environments from where we are now to what are we looking at for post-secondary. And we always talk about with our parents of students with autism, we need to be talking to them, especially if it's a significant um, student with autism with maybe a lack of communication, is, when that child, if something happens to that parent, what is the next step? And what are we looking at? So we want to make sure that we do futures planning so that we have everybody living in a here and now, but also in a what if situation. How do we prepare that child? Parent and family training. This is one where I see that we could really work together in the physician world along with the educational world, because I do believe that there are lots of things out there that a lot of time educators are not even aware of. In just working with Laura, I became aware of several things that I've been able to bring back to my special education directors so that they can be more involved with some of the things in the community that's being offered free of charge that we had no idea about. Anytime we're talking about students with autism, we need to be talking about staff to student ratios. every now and then, and especially as money gets tight, I have, principals call me and they'll say, "Hey, Stacey, I need to know how many kids per adults should be in this room." And the first thing I have to say to them is, I sure wish it was that simple. And we've got all these different things that people have drawn up where they weight students, and that's WEIGHT, meaning that I'm looking at this child and I think, oh, he has a weight of like 4 kids versus this one has a weight of only like 2 kids. The bottom line is we have to take all of those things into consideration so that we make sure that the student has identified activities and that we've got staff available in order to continue the developmental and learning process. And that is important because adaptive behavior accommodation needs across settings, and transitions within the school day. All of those things go into play and thinking about, hey, does this child move independently from one area to the next? Is this child able to, once they get their tray at lunch and they get to go find a place to sit? What does that look like? Are they able to do that on their own? Communication intervention. So here's another area. If we have a student that is nonverbal, we all know that so much of behavior is communication, or the lack of being able to communicate wants and needs. So communication interventions, this is huge because this is one of the first steps that we need to be working with on children that are young, in allowing them a way to communicate what it is that they're trying to say, what it is that they need. Social skills, supports, and strategies. All right, this is a big one, and you guys know that as we talk about autism, we start talking about those different levels of autism, and we can start talking about Asperger's, high functioning. But in all of that, one of the things we realize is that students with autism tend to struggle with social skills or lack of, right? And so those are teaching moments because we've got to make sure that we're working with this child of what is appropriate school behavior. What does that look like? What does it look like when you sit down in a group? And I think anytime I start talking about this, I think of Sheldon, right? And I think of, and most of us have seen Sheldon, and many of us still miss it, that show's no longer on. But we think of all those pieces that, it was like, oh, well, I've got a contract for that. Well, in a social setting, how that is not appropriate. And so we look at what do we need to do? Do we have peer facilitators, circle of friends? Do we do video modeling, role playing? All those pieces should be talked about. Professional educator and staff support. This is a big one. And this is a big one right now, not just with autism, but with behavior. We are finding that as educators, the turnover rate, the lack of finding completely certified educators right now, that is something that you guys know is terribly difficult. And the whole thing that we need to look at with that is we need to make sure that the educators that are working with these students every day have the support that they need and the training that they need to be able to understand the students that they're working with. We need to make sure that they have teaching strategies that are peer-reviewed, research-based. And so we want to make sure that as they're working with these students, not only do they understand the students and have training for the various students that they're going to see, but they also have a toolkit of teaching strategies that are going to be important for teaching that student. And the visual supports is huge. And then at the end of all of this, you can see that if the ARD Committee determines that services are not needed in one or more of the areas listed above, the IEP must include a statement to that effect and the basis upon which the determination was made. So I know you guys are looking at this and thinking, wow, okay, this is one of those things that when a compliance or a monitoring group goes out to look at a certain school district, they've been doing cyclical visits. When they see that they're looking at a folder of student G, and this student is a student with autism, the next thing they're going to ask is, where is that autism supplement? And so, I think it's very important that as you guys are working with parents, that, that you're able to say, hey, I believe, I can help with the fact that, he's going to need more structure. Talk to the school about schedules reflecting minimal and structured time, all those pieces. So you can see how we can go together in making sure that we hit on those pieces. I just have listed in the PowerPoint or the slides just what each one of these, just as we're looking at it here, which ones of these mean what, just in a general overview. And there's lots of them. And I have people say to me, "Oh my gosh, Stacy, I've been doing a meeting and I've been going to a meeting with students with autism, and I've heard us discuss some things, but I don't know that I've heard us discuss these things in as detailed as we probably needed to." And so again, I think it's making sure that everyone realizes what all of these areas are and to what extent they need to be discussed in order to do what's best for kids. All right, one of the next things I wanted to put up is just schedule of services in a least restrictive environment. And it's interesting to me because it seems like we have parents in one or two camps, obviously. We either have parents in the camp that want more services for their child, or we have parents in the camp that they want more services, but they want the services in a different setting. So I just wanted to give you guys a little bit of background on the schedule of services in a least restrictive environment and how the school district sees this. So obviously what I have here is I just start off with, so legally what we always want to look at when we're doing an IEP meeting on a child, and since we're talking about a child with autism, but really we're looking at this with all students that we talk about. What we should look at first is we should look at that general education classroom and that general education setting. That would be the least restrictive. And then what we start looking at is we start looking about, hey, when we did that supplement, we realized that we said this child was going to need this kind of support here. He was going to need that kind of support there. And then we're going to say, okay, what kind of accommodations and supplementary aids and services would we need to give this child? Again, if we could do it over here, if we can stay in the general education curriculum, in the general education setting. And if we realize when we start talking about this, that, oh, it's going to be hard to, that he really needs more support, then here's where we start looking at, okay, well, can we provide some type of in-class support in some of those settings to where we're still in the general education classroom, we're still receiving accommodations and supplementary services, but we're also providing support in that setting. Okay, so really we should always start there with this student is a mainstream student. What would we need to do? If we realize that, oh, based on the goals and objectives and strengths and weaknesses of the child, then we need to look at, can we do this in the class? Can this child be successful? If we're all looking at this in the IEP meeting and saying, well, it would be hard to do this in this area, it'd be hard, then we're going to start looking at pull-out services. So that's been called resource all these years, right? If, how much time does the student go to some type of resource setting where they are getting special education services in a special education room with a special education instructor? Okay. And so a lot of times we're looking at that. I put this down here because what the state does is the state looks at how much time a child is in resource or in the general ed classroom. And a lot of the funding pieces at this time are based on this right here. So you can see how, it's set up, the funding is set up this way based on what we call instructional arrangement. And then a most restrictive in setting would be more a child that's greater than 50%, or then in a group where they're greater than 60% in a self-contained classroom. Okay, so that, obviously 50% would be that half of their day they're in a special education setting, but the other half of the day they're able to go back over into some general ed classrooms with support. So, but we're, legally we're meant to always look at that least restrictive environment. Then the last thing I wanted to show you guys and make sure that you're aware of before we talk a little bit about how do we move forward is I just wanted to talk a little bit about the TSLAT, the Texas Statewide Leadership for Autism Training. And I need to pull this up. I don't think I did this in my last one. Oh, hold on. All right, so I'll go back and make sure that that is working in our slides, but the TSLAT is the Texas Statewide Leadership for Autism. Okay, so I'm going to go just to the TEA website for TSLAT. Maybe. All right, here we go. So we've got the TSLAT. What I love about this autism website is the resources, the video library, and the online courses and training that you can share. So you can see here that if I go to the TSLAT website and I go down to general resources, you're going to see that there are all kinds of resources that show evidence-based practices for autism and students with autism. You'll also notice that you will see lots of areas where you will see family parent resources. And so that is really the main reason why I wanted to take you here and make sure that you realized what's available in this area. Because the TSLAT is something that we all use. When I go to online courses, you can look and see that it gives me all kinds of information here. So it shows you all kinds of autism circuit tools. And there's also an area when you go to the TSLAT that it also gives you the, where it has an area for parents or for educators. Okay, and you can see that it goes on and on. And so this is one of the things that we love about having the library. And you can see a collection of knowledge from experts, teachers, students, and parents. And so you can see here where here's different parent interviews. So parents are able to go here. You can also see that they have them in Spanish as well as in English. So that's another piece that's special. All right. The last thing that I wanted to bring up is just allow you time for questions, but I also wanted you to be able to talk just a second, because our last objective was talking about watch and wait. What do you do if you've got a parent that comes in? And I just want to take a second to talk about how what it looks like on the educational side. So when you've got a parent that comes in, you guys are probably very aware that a child that's less than 3 years old needs to go through the early childhood intervention program, the ECI program. And so, that is one of the areas that we've been talking about at the service centers and with the service center directors about us having more contact with early childhood intervention in hopes of getting more interaction from that group with our districts. We're realizing in the last couple of years that our numbers from ECI are way down. And we know for a fact that when we look at our special education numbers within the school setting, that number is not going down. So we feel like with babies and with the age, 0 to 3, that number is not going down either. And so we really need to help that ECI group get amped back up to serve those students. So if you've got a student or you've got a family that comes in and you have the same concerns, and that the parent has, you're observing that child, you're seeing those pieces that we talked about it for eligibility. The two ways that you want to steer the parent is you want to steer that parent either to ECI if they're less than 3 years old, or their local school district if they're already 3. Because if the parent goes to the school district and the parent calls out to the special education department, a special education parent referral means that the school district has to respond within 15 days of talking to that parent, or that parent putting in, and they would need to put it in writing. But they don't, but if they're willing to say, hey, I really need the school district to evaluate my child, then within 15 days, they should get information back where the school district is talking to them about the process and the referral process. And then you guys know that there's 45 school days to evaluation. When a child goes through ECI, it's a little bit different because ECI carries that child until their 3rd birthday. And there's meant to be this nice little handoff. If your birthday, like mine, is July 8th, there's supposed to be this nice little handoff on July 7th, where starting on July 8th, the school district takes over those services. And all of the testing or the evaluation is completed before that 3rd birthday. And so one of the things that I hope that I've done during this time is I hope that I have hit on our objectives that we started off with in talking about federal and state regulations. I showed you guys how to get to the legal framework in order to see those TEA federal regulations, as well as the Texas Education Code, or Administrative Code. Talked about the school's IEP ARD committee to determine strategies needed, that how every autism evaluation is followed up with an IEP meeting or ARD meeting to determine the student's needs. Every student with autism should have an autism supplement. And then we also talked about examining resources. So in the legal framework, you've got resources. In the TSLAT website, you've got resources. There's tons of resources. But what I love about the TSLAT is that most of those resources are from Texas. And then we spent just a little bit of time of explaining the role of the provider in the early intervention of children with autism, either through the ECI route or through the school district route. So one of the things I've done is I have put together just a questions where you can go to click on this QR code, and it would take you to a Padlet where if you have questions, you can either type in your questions, or it's okay with me if you just unmute yourself and we can do questions. However you guys want to do that if you have any questions.
Thanks, Stacy. My apologies to everyone for my internet going in and out today. This is Laura Young. We do have a couple of questions that have come into the chat, and I'd like to bring those forward while we have others consider their questions. So are all school districts, is the Texas legal framework accessible to all school districts?
Yes, it is. So the legal framework is available to all school districts, and also all school districts have to go into the legal framework and update their processes and policies and procedures. So, at the beginning of this year, you guys are probably very aware of all the changes with dyslexia, and how that's changed over to be more of a special education route, more so than the 504 route. Well, one of the things that every school district had to do, and TEA literally went through and looked at the information that was put in that legal framework for each school district to make sure that they updated their policies and procedures to that updated handbook information. So not only does every school district have access to it, but every school district is expected to go in and put new information in. I know just recently there was a change to, the transition guides, and not only, parents are on the legal framework, they literally couldn't just put a link to a transition guide. They had to put a copy of the transition guide in their website as a part of that legal framework.
Thanks, Stacy. As primary care providers, which is the main audience that we're serving here, what is the biggest thing that you think providers can do to support families as they walk this journey with a child that has some type of autism at some level within that spectrum?
I think, number one, I think they need to understand that the school district is their friend. I laugh. We're doing coaching right now, and any of you that are involved in football at all, I don't think, and my whole point of this is, I don't think any coach decides at the beginning of any year that they do not want to win any football games. Um, and I tend to be an Aggie, so you know what kind of season it was for me. But I think on the other side of the coin, there are not any school districts out there that do not want to do what's best for kids. And so I think number one, I think that parents and you guys need to help the parents tap into the educational entities or the districts, and help them to realize that, hey, we're going to work at this and we're going to be partners in this. And that doesn't mean, though, that we don't, and you guys don't educate parents as you see them on like this supplement. I would venture to guess that there would be parents that, even though they've been in that IEP meeting, and they sat there, and it is one of those times where you feel vulnerable, and I'm one person, me and my husband, and everybody else around the room is from the school district. It is one of those times that is a little bit unnerving. But as they recognize they're a part of the team, it's important for them to make sure that they do speak up about what the needs are, and not only just what their child's needs are, but what the needs of the family are.
That's great,
Stacy, thank you.
Stacy. Go ahead, Wiley.
Sorry, Laura. Stacy, this is Wiley Martin again with the CPAN program. Thank you so much for the presentation. This is awesome information. So my question is, we've had family med doctors and also pediatricians that we've talked to saying that they've diagnosed a child with autism and referred them to the school for services, and the school district will say that they can't accept that diagnosis. So my question, also put that in the chat, was, is there a standard for testing that the schools will accept or won't accept when it comes to primary doctor or pediatrician diagnosis? And then the second part of this question is, sometimes it's hard for um, people that are not within the school district to kind of navigate some of the acronyms. Could you talk a little bit more just on what IEP and the ARD is also? Thank you.
Absolutely. So let me do the acronyms first, and then I'll go back and talk a little bit about, hey, I've done the diagnosis, and they say they can't take that. So an ARD meeting is admission, review, and dismissal. So you think about the phases of a student and into special education, and what you've got referral, which would be your admission, and then you're doing reviews annually at a minimum. And then hopefully at some point we're going to be able to dismiss your child. And so, but it's funny because Texas is pretty much the only people that use the acronym of ARD. Everybody else calls it an IEP, an individualized education program meeting, and it's meant to be an IEP meeting. A lot of people in Texas tend to say it's an ARD meeting, and then you develop an IEP, individualized education program, within that ARD meeting. So it's real interesting because sometimes you tend to get those acronyms and they end up, semantically being one thing to one person and something else to someone else. A lot of people think, well, the IEP is just the goals and objectives, but really the IEP is the whole program and the whole planning, all that paperwork for that child, and it's all about the evaluation, the eligibility. It's about hey, what are the strengths and weaknesses of this child? And then how are we responding to the strengths and weaknesses of that child in the manner of setting up goals and objectives, setting up progress monitoring to see how the child's doing along the way, and then looking at, based on these needs of the child, what's going to be the best placement, that least restrictive environment for that child in the educational setting. And then we're also talking about transition already. We should be talking about us all the way as we start going is, hey, how are we transitioning this child, whether it be from ECI to regular school, to how are we transitioning from one grade level to the next, on to how do we then transition to post-secondary and community work, or the workforce, right? And so that's where some of those acronyms come. There is a long list of acronyms in special education, and I always laugh because people will say, "Oh, wow, about the time I get that, they seem to change it." There's a little bit of truth with that too. Now, talking a little bit about the evaluation. So the second part of your question would be that. So when we let me just use even Scottish Rite for a second. So we all know about Scottish Rite. We also know what Scottish Rite provides everybody, right? And we also know what type of information you're going to get out of Scottish Rite. And, not to say that I think any of you would be any different, right? We can all say that each one of you is a Scottish Rite. Anything you provide the school district is top notch and up there. But, I will say this, that even when school districts get information from, say, Scottish Rite, or maybe a parent has taken their child to, wherever the best center available in Massachusetts or Vanderbilt, whatever. Here's what the attorneys will say to the school districts. The attorneys will say to the school districts that when you accept an evaluation, then you are accepting every single piece that's within that evaluation. And so what will happen there is, let's just say you get an evaluation from Scottish Rite. We know that they typically do dyslexia evaluations, but let's say you get that evaluation or from somewhere, and it really is a full evaluation that talks about the communication, verbal and nonverbal, and the social of the child. Let's say you get this excellent, but then it has all of these recommendations. Okay, so if you accept that, and the school side, if you accept that evaluation as is, then how do you sit back and say, well, we're accepting this as is, but then as educators, you start looking at all those recommendations, and then you say, well, but then we like this one, or we will do this one, and in in the real world, I'd like to say that when they look at all those recommendations, they would look at all of those in a real world and be able to go, oh, we'll be able to do all of these, right? And sometimes I say the ideal world versus the real world. In the real world, they start looking at all that. And sometimes that's not necessarily the case. Now, that's not why they're not accepting the evaluation, but that is partially why, because the attorneys would say, you need to do your own evaluation. You need to make sure that you've put your team together, that you've spent the time to observe this child, looking at all of those activity-based things that you would do in order to be able to observe all those stereotypical movements, all of those repetitive movements, all of those pieces, so that you're putting together a plan of things that you have observed, and that you also know what then in the educational setting you're going to do to make sure that you set that child up for success. One of the things that I am seeing that I think is positive to you saying, hey, we've diagnosed this child. You guys would be surprised. I have received before like a prescription pad, a note on a prescription pad that says this child meets eligibility criteria for XYZ start services. Now, you don't see that often, okay? But you also can see how the school district then has to have more data than that as far as what kind of behaviors, what areas are we seeing that are strengths, what areas are we seeing, in order to put together an individualized education program with goals and objectives of how to take the next step. Going back to, I think I've said this, but going back to, hey, you do get that evaluation in there that says this child meets diagnosis for, and let's say you get all this great stuff. What I'm seeing that they say, hey, we need to do our own evaluation, but we're going to make sure that we take pieces out of the evaluation you brought us. And they should always consider that evaluation that's been brought to the school district from a physician, and or just, that a parent has gone to some type of center outside and paid money for an evaluation. It should always be considered by the IEP team.
Wiley had to drop. I'm sorry about that. He had to take a call that came in, Stacy. So just to make sure that I'm understanding and clarify for those that are on the phone, I think I understand what you're saying here. So would you recommend then, we have a lot of families who cannot afford and then to have that testing done. They, the challenges we have in Northeast Texas and such. So my question is that would the best step for that family be then to come to the school district, ask for a specific person, and I'm not sure who that would be, and then have something in writing that says, please evaluate my child for autism or dyslexia or for special education services? Would that be the best thing for our families who just do not have the financial means to have independent testing done?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, and I would think too, encourage them if, and a lot of time, hopefully they've already met with their child's educational team. So many of the districts now are having those days where the kids are out of school, but they're having time where the parents go up and meet with the teachers. So I feel like with the response intervention pieces that people are doing, the MTSS, the tiered structured interventions, I don't think there should be any ahas about a student with autism or a student with, surely if the parents have seen it, the school district has been talking to the parent, or the parent's been talking to the school district. But absolutely, all they have to do is say, hey, we would like our child evaluated. And if they put it in writing, the district has 15 days to respond, to start getting it. Hey, we've really done consent. We've explained to the parent what that means when they ask and they turn in something to us saying they want testing. And then your 45 school day timeline starts.
Okay, so is that 15 school days or 15 calendar days?
I believe that one is actually calendar days, if you want me to be honest.
Okay, great. And then is there any magic wording that families should use? So if I'm a primary care provider on here and I know that I have some families that need to address the school district, A, who do they speak with at the school? And B, is there some kind of magic verbiage they should use?
If if they speak to the child's teacher, they could say to the child's teacher, hey, I would like to request a special education assessment. And if they think it's autism, they can say, and specifically autism evaluation as well. Anytime you ask for an autism evaluation, you're going to get a full individual evaluation anyway, because for any kind of eligibility, you have to have full evaluation, which means you're going to have achievement. You're going to have, they're not going to just say, oh, we think this child has autism, without having actually gone through the whole battery of evaluations, in order to provide, again, realize that they get a clear picture of strengths and weaknesses for the child.
Okay, and
And
that
I think,
45 school days, I'm sorry, go
yes,
ahead.
go ahead.
And the 45 school days, is that to complete the evaluation or to begin the evaluation?
That's to complete the evaluation. So
Okay,
from
and
the, So from the date that the parents asks for an evaluation, that's where you have those 15 calendar days. The school has 15 calendar days to respond back to the parent as far as just, hey, the two scenarios would be, hey, we want to meet with you. We want to talk about this. Maybe they say, we don't feel like there's enough data to do assessment right now, but this is what we are doing. Okay. But they would still need to put that in writing if the district chose that avenue. Okay, not many districts are choosing that avenue, and you guys are probably very familiar with the Houston Chronicle article, however many years ago, right? And so, they're not doing very many refusals to test. But then
Okay.
the next step then is then they're providing that parent with consent to test and, making sure that the parent has their procedural safeguards and their rights so that they can make sure that, hey, the parent understands what this really means, what we're going to go through and do. And then there's 45 school days for the evaluation to be finished. Because then after that 45th school day, let's say that I get it finished and it's December 12th. Let's say I'm at day 32 and it's December 12th and I'm finished with my evaluation, then I have now 30 calendar days to have my IEP meeting to put things in place.
Okay, and we've had a couple questions in here. One is from Dr. Turner. I've seen it take longer than 45 days usually. Who do the parents and Dr. Turner said, or we as PCPs contact if that 45 days is not met? And then there's a second question that says, what if the school district fails to meet the 15-day deadline? How should people proceed?
I will say the 15-day deadline is a little bit, I'm not going to say it's tricky, but it's interesting because that really shouldn't even be coming about with parent request. But when I did training for several years before I came back to the service center, I would have educators say to me, well, on a school request, and I'm like, what do you mean on a school? We don't sometimes get it done in the 15 days. And I'm like, okay, what do you mean? It doesn't in the federal regulations say, well, if the parent requests, you only have 15 days, but if the school's just going through the process, you get more days. I'm like, it doesn't say that, because what it says in the regulations is that you should test when you suspect a disability. Period. So the 15 days is really just that piece to give parents that piece of, hey, the school is supposed to respond back to me. Are we moving forward with this? Or are they going to talk to me about other things we're doing because why we're not going to move forward if they don't think it's necessary? As far as the 45 calendar days, and then the 30 days beyond that, that is the state performance plan indicators that get turned into the federal government. Initial timelines are a part of that, and it is a big deal. Districts that are not 100% on that. So I'm trying to think of what our day was that we had to turn that in, because really what happens in the school business is it goes like from July 1st to June 30th. So any kids that are referred between July 1st and June 30th that finish the process, that means they've had their evaluation, that means they've had their IEP meeting, they look at those dates. They have to turn in, we have to turn in, I say each district has to turn in how many parent consents did they get within that June or July 1st to June 30th. And then they also have to turn in, okay, how many of those got completed within timelines. And that's both the 45-day timeline and the 30-day beyond that. Now, the only thing that I can say why that might look different at all is the state gives a little bit of leeway in that they say when the consent was returned to the school. Now, I'm a little bit picky with my schools because I tell them, how are you going to fight that? To me, if I give it to a parent on if I gave it to a parent on November 1st and I don't get it back till November 30th, but they signed it on the 15th, it's going to be really hard, because it's going to be really hard if we go to some type litigious or some type of hearing for me to prove that they didn't get it back to me. Maybe it was in the backpack, maybe it was, all those things. So I always tell people, if you're going to try to say that you didn't receive it, you probably need to make sure that you have some type of really good process in place to prove that, which would be hard to do. So I always talk about using that consent date that the parent signed and the date that that parent used when they signed that consent. But
So parents need to sign for the testing. So there was a comment in here, and I know that our time is starting to run out. So there was a comment in here that this individual's from a physician's office. They find that the parents state they are not aware if their child is on an IEP or a 504 plan. But you're stating that they would need to sign for that. So they would be involved in that.
they would. They would. And, and as far as not understanding, I can see where a parent, if the child is in one or the other, might be a little bit confused, but in both, they're having to put together a plan. Parents are invited, and they
Okay.
should be being involved.
And do the school districts offer parent trainings on IEPs and 504s so parents better understand the process and the parent rights, or is that not a requirement?
It is not a requirement. And I would say that we do that. We do some of that at the service centers where we're willing to do that. And then we've also got parent groups like the partners research or the partners network. I'm all of a sudden can't think of what their parents research. Oh, why can I not think of what that is? But PATH is what their letters are. But the nice thing, they do quite a bit in our area, and we work closely with them as far as family involvement, family cooperation, to make sure that they understand, that their rights. Now, one of the other things that, when a parent gets their procedural safeguards, and they get that at every meeting for special education, prior to every meeting, and it's supposed to be provided to them in a way that they understand what it says. But on the back of that, it always has, the who to contact in the district if they've got questions. Then the next step is it says who to contact at their service center. So, at the service center, it'll say my name in Region 8. Hey, if you're not happy with what you're getting out of your district and this contact, here's another contact for you. And it's the service center. And I do get some calls from them. And then obviously the next step is it gives them the contact for TEA.
Great. Couple of just quick questions. Does an email count as a written request to start the 15-day timeline?
I would say yes. If I'm the director, I would say yes.
Okay.
Again, I'm that person after being a director that, we all know that, if I'm going to be sitting there at some point and I'm going to try to say, hey, we didn't get that in writing. If there's an email that came to me that on a certain date that a parent can pull up or an attorney can pull up, again, I'm going to have a hard time saying I didn't get that in writing. So I would say yes, that should start the 15 days to actually having the parent come in and talk about, hey, talk to us about why you're wanting this. Again, on some of these kids, if it's significant, it's surprising to me at this point in time that the parents are having to ask versus the school district saying, hey, these are the things we're doing. And once we get to this next step, if we're not seeing progress with your child, then we're going to need to look at special education.
That would maybe give us that timeline of the 15, 45, and 30, so that if I have a provider that reaches back out to me here, we can share that with them so they know what the timeline is.
Okay.
Or was that something in the PowerPoint that I missed during
No,
the
I
early
didn't have
Tuesday?
that, but I can add that.
I think that would be helpful.
Yes, I can add that.
Great.
Because
if
there used
anybody
to
is
be an area
interested,
in the legal framework, but it doesn't look like I'm finding it as quickly as I used to could. There used to be just a resource that I could open up and it literally had like a, just if this, then this, and then this.
all right, great. We get at CPAN, we get quite a few calls about autism evaluations and such like that. And with the families who are less financially able to have that done on their own, plus the fact that it's taking sometimes as far out as 4 months or so just to get an evaluation done, it'd be great to be able to share with them the information that you have shared with us today that they can go directly to.
Okay. And hey, Laura, I did find that. If you want me to share real quick,
Yeah,
you guys
that
can,
would be great.
hopefully you guys can see right here, I'm in the legal framework. So again, I've gone to legal framework. I've gone to document pages right here in documents. And then here's my timeline tree. So, and I can actually take this, but you can see here's my timeline. Oh, and actually it says school days here. Sorry about that. I said calendar, but it's actually school days.
That's the 15 school days.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
But
Okay.
then here's the 45 school days. So where I found that is back on the legal framework. And then on the legal framework, I went to documents, and under documents is where I found then that timeline. And there it is. And so that is part of why I shared that legal framework piece with you, is because we use it a lot. I use it a lot. And I always tell my staff, especially if they're new, I'm like, if you don't know the legal framework, you should. Back when I did my training way back when, they made us go through the federal regulations and they made us tab it and they made us, now that was before we had all these hefty nifty websites. But anyway,